Hello, I'm Jonasz Lewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Imagine living in a country where the state can call you up for war, not twice a year, but any day and any hour, without warning. That's the reality Russia could be preparing for. Forget stability, forget predictability. Moscow wants a draft that never sleeps. And once that system is in place, no young Russian man will be out of reach. Welcome to the new year-round machinery of mobilization. Tonight, we're turning to Moscow, where the Kremlin seems determined to prove that time really is just a social construct, especially when it comes to sending men to war. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia is carrying out its largest military draft in over a decade, but behind the numbers lies a story of coercion, deception, and a growing shadow economy. This spring and summer, Russia is drafting 160,000 men into military service, the biggest conscription campaign since 2011. The Kremlin says conscripts won't be sent to Ukraine, but human rights groups report widespread manipulation and forced contracts that lead directly to the front lines. New laws have expanded eligibility, raising the conscription age limit to 30 and allowing contracts from age 18. Police now use phone data and surveillance to track potential draftees, while raids and detentions have intensified, especially in Moscow. In poorer regions, men are abducted from homes and shelters, often without warning. Some are misled with fake job offers, others coerced despite serious health issues. Families report missing loved ones and suspect their military pay is being stolen. A black market has exploded around the draft. Fake exemption documents can cost up to $87,000, while legal aid firms charge thousands for help that often leads nowhere. Even legitimate medical exemptions are routinely ignored.
And now we're zoning in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Russia's military draft may soon become a permanent fixture. Lawmakers are pushing for year-round conscription. The proposed changes could reshape how enlistment works across the country.
A new bill introduced by Russian lawmakers aims to make military conscription a year-round process. To do this, they plan to amend two key federal laws: on military duty and military service, and on alternative civilian service. The bill would allow enlistment officers to operate continuously, conducting medical exams, psychological assessments, and conscription commission meetings outside the traditional spring and fall windows. However, not all citizens would be affected equally. Exemptions remain for teachers, rural workers, and residents of the far north, who would still be conscripted seasonally. The state oversight is also tightening. The FSB now has direct access to enlistment data and electronic summonses. Once a draft notice appears, the individual is barred from leaving Russia and faces restrictions on property, employment, and financial activities if they fail to report within 20 days. The bill is expected to pass this fall and take effect January 1, 2026, potentially expanding Russia's draft infrastructure ahead of future mobilizations.
And now we're zooming in on Moscow to explore the issue in greater detail. For decades, Russia has relied on a twice-a-year draft system, one in the spring and one in the fall. It was a Soviet tradition, you see, as rigid as May Day parades or grey concrete apartment blocks. But now, Russia's State Duma is preparing to throw that calendar out of the window. The head of the Duma's Defense Committee has introduced a bill that would allow military points to process men year-round, instead of in these traditional two periods. On paper, he says this would reduce bottlenecks, ease the burden on officials and, my personal favorite, give draftees more predictability about their future. Predictability in this case, meaning that at any given moment, they could be ordered to show up and prepare for war. It's a bit like being told that Russian roulette is safer now, because the revolver is always loaded. This isn't about efficiency or predictability. if the Kremlin can process potential soldiers year-round, it gains two big advantages. First, flexibility. The government no longer has to wait until spring or fall to massively increase troop numbers. If Putin wakes up tomorrow and decides he needs another 100,000 men for his war in Ukraine, the commissariats can start filling the ranks immediately. Second, there is control. The ability to summon young men whenever the authorities choose means the draft becomes a tool, not just for war, but for silencing dissent. Protesting against the Kremlin? Congratulations! You may suddenly discover you're medically fit for service and headed for the trenches. The Kremlin has a habit of turning bad ideas into grim realities. When Russia introduced partial mobilization in 2022, it was sold as limited, controlled and temporary. But what followed was chaos and hundreds of thousands of young Russians fleeing the country. Now, with the year-round processing, the Kremlin would make that state of emergency permanent. It's mobilization without an end date, simply being the new normal. And the promises that men will know their status in advance, that's laughable, really. While young Russians may feel a false sense of security, the reality is that their fate will rest in the hands of officials who have never hesitated to break their word. And then there is also the matter of optics. Expanding the draft cycle to 365 days a year sends a clear signal. Russia is preparing for a long war. That, in itself, is a message not just to Russian society, but also to the outside world. Because in the end, this proposed idea is about locking Russia into a state of war, not just militarily, but psychologically. It tells the world that the Kremlin is prepared to fight as long as it takes. And it tells Russians that there will be no escape. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, every season is now draft season. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, we're talking about this new legislation on conscription in Russia. Should we read a lot into it? I mean, it could be a discussion on basically just, bureaucratic enhancements. But it could also be something slightly more sinister. Which of these do you think is more likely?
Well, I think that we should be concerned about it. First, by deciding to draft each month rather than draft only twice a year, Moscow is indicating that it wants to avoid the kind of protests against the draft. So in that sense, it suggests that the Kremlin is facing problems in raising manpower. On the other hand, by drafting people each month rather than twice a year, Moscow can easily up the number of people taken in, and so that would allow the Russian government to raise a much larger army much more quickly without the kind of protests that it's faced in the past. So I think it should be a matter of concern, although the fact that the Russian government has had to take this, can only be described as a deceptive measure, shows that the Russian people are not entirely enthusiastic with Mr. Putin's aggressive plans.
So this also, I'm assuming, should be seen in the context of massive losses which Russia has sustained. Earlier reports suggested that the total number of troops eliminated from the battlefield, which includes both casualties and people who were injured so that they couldn't return to the fight, was more than 1 million. Now, any other country, after suffering 1 million losses on the battlefield, would probably go through a period of some serious political change, but not Russia.
Well, the Russian government has never been shy about sacrificing its own population and using its media to mobilize the population has convinced many people that Russia is at war not just with Ukraine, but with the entire West. That is sufficient to get a large percentage of the population, especially those who don't have a lot of money, who are not being paid high salaries, who live in the periphery, often in non-Russian areas, that they have no choice but to go to war. if you look at what happened during World War II, Russia lost far more people than others because it kept throwing its forces in and accepting losses that, as you say, few other countries would accept without demanding political change.
So does this mean that Russia has this sort of, automatic advantage over any of its adversaries, or is it simply a question of how you actually manage the question, of mobilization, of conscription, and all that? When comparing it to Ukraine, for example, which of these two countries do you think is more successful? Is actually encouraging the population to participate in the war effort. Ukraine has had some problems recently highlighted by the fact that some young Ukrainians are often living abroad. They are actually taking advantage of some exemptions. Some people are angry that they are not fighting on the front lines. But is it as simple as that?
Well, it's not as simple as that. Russia saw a massive outflow of more than 100,000 men when a larger mobilization was declared earlier. So it's not true that Russia doesn't have problems of mobilizing troops. In fact, this step, as I said, gives it the chance to hide some of what it's doing, lest it spark outrage the way a twice-a-year draft does. That Ukraine has difficulties is certainly the case, and those difficulties have intensified. In general, it's been true that when one side sees itself as making progress, as winning on the battlefield, if you will, it finds it fairly easy to recruit. When things go in the other direction, then it has more difficulties. Earlier, Russia had a great deal of problems because it was not winning anything like as quickly as Mr. Putin had suggested. And Ukraine was doing better because it looked like Ukraine was doing far better. People were talking about a Ukrainian victory even. Now that the Russian army has been making advances, admittedly relatively small ones, many Russians see this, because of the way the media plays it up, as an indication that Russia is winning. They hear that veterans will benefit heavily after the war, and so they're interested in getting in there, getting listed as a veteran so that they'll get those benefits. Ukraine does not have that kind of option just now, and so you're seeing resistance. But it's not simply that Ukrainians are one way and Russians are another with respect to this. The Ukrainians have shown themselves remarkably capable of fighting. If you would ask any military expert in February of 2022 whether we'd still have a war between Russia and Ukraine, whether Ukraine could field enough men and get enough arms to resist the Russian army, no one would have thought that was probable. But the Ukrainian army has done extremely well. Its people are extremely motivated. And so the fact that there are problems in complecting the military shouldn't surprise anyone when it looks like Ukraine isn't doing so well. But one should not think that the Russians are having no problems at all. Indeed, as I said, I think the choice to move to monthly inductions rather than twice-a-year inductions is a way of hiding from the Russian people just how costly this war has been. They've used other means as well, lying and not reporting about how many deaths and injuries there have been. So I think you don't want to say Russia's in a good place and Ukraine is in a bad place. The fact is both countries have problems mobilizing, and that Ukraine has done far better than almost anyone would have predicted.
Now, speaking of problems and of the war being costly, some people have pointed out that this legislative proposal, because it still has not actually been rubber-stamped, it's still in the preliminary stages when it comes to being enacted, it omits certain issues which could make it slightly more difficult to implement it in real life. That includes, for example, the ever-present problem of financing all the people who are supposed to handle the administrative side of this year-round conscription. Do you think that this is simply an omission, or is the Kremlin simply thinking, okay, if we actually implement that, we're going to force people into doing what we believe they must do, and we're not going to, countenance any protests there?
Well, the Russian government is certainly going to come down hard on protests. It has already. With respect to being able to finance this, in some ways, the Russian system, which has been in place since the mid-1970s of a two-time-a-year conscription, has it appears to be very efficient and cheap. But the problem is, one, you have to pull people off other jobs, doctors, other examiners in the draft process, and people off of other jobs in order to train them. By moving to a year-round draft, Russia will have to pull some people away, but it will have not the same kind of crash program twice a year, and will it have a negative effect on some other components of the military? Yes, but it will not be nearly as large as many people assume, because the current system doesn't work all that well. If you're processing people too quickly, you may miss people who should be deferred for medical reasons. If you're ginning up training procedures twice a year and then closing them down, that's not an efficient system either. So I think what you have to say is, will it cost Russia something more? Yes. Will it cost Russia enormous amounts that it can't possibly afford? I don't think so. So I think that Westerners who see this as something Moscow can't afford are missing the point. I think Moscow can afford this, especially if, as I suspect, Mr. Putin's goals are far beyond Ukraine and will require an even larger Russian military than the one he has today.
So following up on that very quickly, because we're running out of time, do you think it is realistic to assume that Russia really does have such a grand plan, for example, of attacking other countries militarily, or will it stick to the established tactic of basically moving below the threshold of full-scale war just to avoid any sort of reprisals from NATO, which arguably is a much stronger fighting force than Ukraine? And as we've already mentioned, Russia isn't doing that well against Ukraine either.
Well, Russia will be happy to avoid having to use military force, but it will always want to have enough military force to use if it decides that's the only way forward. I don't think the primary targets of a Russian military move in the immediate future are NATO countries, but there are a lot of other Russian neighbors in the Caucasus, especially northern Kazakhstan, where using military force, or at least having a credible threat that you could use it, will be an important part of Russian policy, especially if Mr. Putin thinks he's gotten deference from the United States, at least, if not from the West as a whole, that would allow him to continue his hopes to restore some kind of much larger Russian empire.
Paul Goebel was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
And now we move on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. A controversial statement from Slovakia's Prime Minister is making waves across Europe. Robert Fico is backing the Putin-Trump summit and repeating Kremlin narratives about the war in Ukraine.
In a Facebook video, Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico hailed the Alaska summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin as a breakthrough, claiming it accomplished several tasks and challenged the West's black and white view of the war in Ukraine. Fico repeated Kremlin narratives, saying the conflict has historical roots and that both Ukraine and Russia deserve security guarantees, a phrase quickly picked up by Russian state media. Fico, known for his pro-Russian rhetoric, has long opposed military aid to Ukraine and now says the summit held up a mirror to Europe's leadership.
Donald Trump praised Belarus and its authoritarian leader and hinted at a possible mass release of political prisoners. Human rights group Vyasna currently lists 1,184 political prisoners in the country.
In a post on Truth Social, President Donald Trump called Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko a powerful leader and said he hopes 1,300 prisoners will soon be freed, a number close to the estimated count of political detainees in Belarus. Trump claimed he had a great conversation with Lukashenko, thanking him for releasing 16 prisoners and discussing the release of over 1,000 more. Belarusian state media reported that Lukashenko invited Trump and his family to Minsk, and that Trump accepted. This follows a June visit by a US delegation which reportedly led to the release of 14 long-held prisoners in Belarus from 6 countries, including Poland and Japan. Among them was Sergei Tsikhanouski, husband of opposition leader Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya.
Russia's latest missile strikes may have backfired. After targeting Azerbaijani energy assets in Ukraine, Moscow now faces the risk of pushing a former ally into Kiev's corner with weapons.
Russian missile and drone attacks recently destroyed facilities belonging to Sokar, Azerbaijan's state oil company operating in Ukraine. In response, Baku issued a sharp warning. It may escalate support beyond humanitarian aid and begin supplying weapons directly to Ukraine. Azerbaijan's Avia aggregate plant, already producing 122 and 155mm artillery shells since 2022, could become a key supplier. These munitions are exactly what Ukraine needs to sustain its defense against Russia. Baku is also seeking Turkish peacekeepers, embedding NATO systems into its military and deepening ties with Western defense networks, all moves that counter Moscow's influence.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.